I was late for the most important dinner of my life, meeting my fiancé's reclusive billionaire father. My heart pounded with panic as I rushed into the grand dining hall, but I froze in the doorway, sitting at the head of the table, wearing the expensive cashmere scarf I had given away just hours earlier, was the same homeless man I had shared my only sandwich with in the park. The test I didn't know I was taking was already over, and I had no idea if I had passed or failed. Before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe. Drop a comment, where are you watching from? My name is Madison Cole, and I am 27 years old. Before that night, my world was a small, carefully curated universe, built on principles that seemed a galaxy away from the Sterling's sprawling estate. Chicago is my city, but my Chicago wasn't the glittering skyline of Michigan Avenue or the opulent mansions of the Gold Coast. My Chicago was the rhythmic clatter of the L train outside my window, the smell of roasted nuts from a street vendor on a cold day, and the vibrant, chaotic, and beautiful tapestry of neighborhoods like Pilsen and Logan Square. I lived in a third-floor walk-up with a radiator that hissed like a snake and a window that looked out onto a brick wall, and I loved it. It was mine. Every mismatched piece of furniture, every dog-eared book on my shelves, every chipped coffee mug was a testament to a life I had built myself, on my own terms. I am, by trade and by soul, a social worker. I work at a small, perpetually underfunded nonprofit called Second Start, which provides resources and support for low-income families trying to navigate the labyrinth of bureaucracy to secure housing, food, and employment. It's not a glamorous job. There are no six-figure salaries, no expense accounts, no corporate retreats. My biggest victories aren't celebrated with champagne and bonuses, but with the quiet relief in a mother's eyes when she finds out her kids will have a warm place to sleep, or the shy, gap-toothed smile of a child who gets a new backpack for school. The pay is barely enough to cover my rent and student loans, but the work pays me in a currency Arthur Sterling's billions could never touch. It gives me purpose. It reminds me every single day that beneath the noise of wealth and status, we are all just people, connected by the same fundamental needs for safety, dignity, and a little bit of kindness. This, of course, was the very thing that made me so profoundly unsuitable in the eyes of David's family. I met David Sterling on a rainy Tuesday. It was one of those rare instances where our worlds accidentally collided. I was running a donation drive for winter coats outside a grocery store in a neighborhood far nicer than my own, hoping to catch the evening rush of shoppers. He was walking out, a bag of groceries in one hand and an umbrella in the other, his brow furrowed as he scrolled through emails on his phone. He was so engrossed he didn't see me, and a gust of wind sent my carefully stacked pile of flyers fluttering into the street, plastering themselves against the wet pavement. I let out a sigh of frustration, watching my hard work turn into soggy pulp. Without looking up from his phone, he simply sidestepped the mess and continued on his way. I remember thinking, of course, just another rich guy in his own world. But then he stopped. He stood for a moment, then slowly turned around. He looked at me, truly looked at me, bundled in my worn-out parka, my nose red from the cold, and then he looked at the pathetic mess of flyers in the street. He put his phone away, turned back, and helped me pick them up. His apology was genuine, his eyes a surprising shade of warm brown. He asked what I was doing, and when I told him, he didn't just nod politely. He listened. He asked thoughtful questions. He ended up buying 2 brand new coats from the store and putting them in my donation box, along with a $20 bill he pushed into my hand for a hot coffee. He also asked for my number. For the first 6 months, our relationship was a secret, a beautiful bubble that existed only between my tiny apartment and his sleek, minimalist condo. In that bubble, he wasn't David Sterling, heir to the Sterling fortune. He was just David, the man who loved the way I snorted when I laughed, who would listen for hours as I talked about the families at Second Start, who seemed genuinely fascinated by a world so different from his own. He was drawn to my passion, my independence. He said I was the most real person he'd ever met. He made me feel seen, not for what I could offer him in terms of status or connections, but for exactly who I was. He was my escape from the harsh realities of my work, and I was his escape from the gilded cage of his life. The bubble burst the day he told his family about me. The disapproval wasn't a dramatic, movie-like confrontation. It was far more insidious than that. It was a slow, creeping poison. It came in the form of his mother's polite, yet pointed questions about my upbringing. It was in the way his sister would talk about her charity galas, implicitly framing my hands-on work as something quaint and unsophisticated. They never said the words, "You're not good enough." They didn't have to. Their message was clear in every condescending smile, every backhanded compliment, every casual mention of the debutante balls and Ivy League legacies that defined their world. I was a novelty, a project, David's little dalliance with the common folk. David, bless his heart, tried to shield me at first. He defended me, argued with them, insisted they didn't know the real me, but the pressure was immense, a constant grinding force. He had been raised in a system where approval was the ultimate prize, and his father's approval was the grandest prize of all. Slowly, subtly, I watched it begin to change him. Or perhaps it didn't change him, but rather, it revealed a part of him I had never seen, a part that had been conditioned since birth to value appearances above all else. He started suggesting I look for a better job, maybe something in nonprofit management, at a large, prestigious foundation where I could make a real difference, and a real salary. He started buying me clothes, beautiful, expensive things, that felt like costumes, gently phasing out the simple, practical wardrobe I had always worn. He was trying to mold me, to sand down my rough edges until I was smooth and polished enough to fit into the Sterling family portrait. And the worst part was, I started to let him. I loved him, and I wanted him to be happy. I told myself that changing my clothes or talking less about my work was a small price to pay for our future. And then came the subject of his father. Arthur Sterling was less a man and more a myth. He was a ghost who haunted the pages of Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. After the sudden and tragic death of his wife 15 years ago, he had retreated from the world. He never attended public events, never gave interviews, and was rumored to run his global empire from a secluded office within the walls of the Sterling estate. No one outside of his most trusted inner circle had seen him in over a decade. The stories David told were of a brilliant, ruthless, and deeply eccentric man. A man who valued strength, perfection, and, above all, appearances. He was a man who, according to David, could spot weakness from a mile away and had no tolerance for anything less than the absolute best. He sees things differently, Mads, David had tried to explain one night, his voice tense. He believes that how you present yourself to the world is a direct reflection of your inner discipline. A person who is careless with their appearance is careless in their business. A person who is late shows a lack of respect, not just for others, but for themselves. The pressure of the dinner was a crescendo in this symphony of anxiety. For weeks, it was all David could talk about. This dinner was my one and only chance to get his father's blessing. It wasn't just a formality, it was a trial. If I passed, our engagement would be celebrated, and I would be welcomed into the family. If I failed, well, David never finished that sentence. He didn't need to. The unspoken threat hung heavy in the air between us. His father's word was law. This brings me to the instructions. They began 3 days before the dinner, a relentless barrage of rules and regulations designed to strip away every last vestige of Madison Cole and replace her with a Sterling-approved automaton. "Okay, let's go over it again," he'd said, pacing his condo while I sat on the plush leather sofa, feeling like a student about to take a final exam I hadn't studied for. "First, your job. Don't mention second start. If he asks what you do, just say you work in community outreach. It's vague, it's corporate sounding. He thinks charity is a hobby for bored housewives, not a profession. To him, it signifies a lack of ambition, a weakness. Every word felt like a betrayal of the people I fought for every day, of the very core of who I was. I nodded silently, a sick feeling churning in my stomach. "Second, your family. My mother already did a background check, so he knows the basics. But don't elaborate. Don't tell him stories about growing up in a 2-bedroom apartment with your parents and your brother. Don't talk about your father working 2 jobs as a mechanic or your mother as a school secretary. He values prestige, lineage. Just keep it brief. Say you're from Chicago and leave it at that." He was asking me to be ashamed of the people who had sacrificed everything for me, the people who had taught me the value of hard work and integrity. Another piece of me chipped away. "Third, the dress." He gestured to the garment bag hanging on the closet door. Inside was the silk dress I was to wear, and with it, the cashmere scarf. It was a beautiful set, a soft shade of cream that probably cost more than my last 3 months' rent. Wear it exactly as it is. Don't add anything. Don't change anything. The scarf is important. It completes the look. It shows you understand elegance and subtlety. Appearance is everything, Mads. It's the first thing he'll judge. Yuan. And the final, most important rule, the one he repeated like a mantra. Above all, Madison, you cannot be late. Punctuality is a sign of respect. To him, being late is the ultimate sign of arrogance. It's telling him that your time is more important than his. It's an insult he will not forgive. I looked at the man I loved, the man who had once been drawn to my realness, now desperately trying to package me into a product his father would approve of. His eyes were wide with a fear I recognized, the deep, abiding fear of a child who has spent his entire life trying and failing to please an unpleasable parent. I saw the immense weight he carried, and in that moment, my own anxieties were eclipsed by a wave of pity for him. And so, I agreed. I agreed to all of it. I agreed to erase myself, piece by painful piece, for the sake of his happiness, for the sake of our future. I told myself it was just for one night of playing a part, and then we could go back to being us. I was so naive. I didn't realize that by the time I walked out of his condo that evening, us was already a thing of the past. The stage was set, my costume was chosen, my lines were memorized. I was ready for the performance of a lifetime, a performance to decide if I was worthy of the sterling name. I just didn't realize that the real test, the only one that truly mattered, wouldn't be happening at a dinner table. It would happen on a cold park bench, hours before I even set foot in that mansion. And it was a test I was destined to fail in David's eyes, and in doing so, pass in the only way that counted. The campaign to erase Madison Cole began in earnest on a Tuesday, 3 days before the dinner. It didn't happen with a single, dramatic declaration, but in a series of calculated, soul-crushing conversations that took place within the sterile, artfully empty walls of David's Lincoln Park condo. His apartment was a study in beige and chrome, a space so devoid of personal touches it felt more like a luxury hotel suite than a home. There were no stacks of books on the coffee table, no sentimental photographs on the walls, no sign that a life was actually being lived there. In retrospect, I see it was the perfect staging ground for dismantling mine. I had arrived that evening expecting a quiet dinner, a respite from the mounting pressure. Instead, I found David pacing the length of his Persian rug, his jaw tight, a frantic energy radiating from him. He hadn't even bothered to put on music. The silence of the apartment was heavy, amplifying the sound of his expensive shoes on the polished hardwood floor. "Hey," I said softly, setting my bag down. "Everything okay?" He stopped and ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "We need to talk. About the dinner. We need to prepare." The word, prepare, landed with a thud in the quiet room. It wasn't the word a man used when introducing his fiancé to his father. It was the word a general used before sending his troops into battle. I felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach, the one that had become a permanent resident there ever since this dinner was announced. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "What do we need to prepare? Should I read up on his company's latest stock performance?" He didn't smile. "This isn't a joke, Mads. This is my father. You get one first impression, and that's it. There are no second chances with him." He gestured for me to sit on the white leather sofa that was as beautiful as it was uncomfortable. I perched on the edge of the cushion, feeling like I was in a job interview. He remained standing, looming over me, which I'm sure was unintentional, but it had the immediate effect of making me feel small. "Let's start with your work," he began, his tone all business. "We can't have you talking about second start." I recoiled as if he'd slapped me. "What? David, that's my life. It's who I am. And I love that about you," he said quickly, a placating gesture that felt utterly insincere. "But he won't. You have to understand his mindset. To him, small-scale charity, what you do, it's sentimental. He believes in systemic change, through ruthless efficiency, not handouts. He'll see your work as a weakness, a sign that you're guided by emotion instead of logic." I thought of Maria. A single mother of 3, I had spent the last 6 months helping to find stable housing after she fled an abusive partner. I thought of the tears in her eyes last week when she showed me the keys to her new modest apartment. I thought of her little boy, Leo, who had drawn me a picture of his new bedroom. Was that weakness? Was that sentimentality? "So, what do I say when he asks me what I do every day?" I asked, my voice colder than I intended. "You say you work in community outreach and resource management." he said, the pre-rehearsed phrase rolling off his tongue smoothly. It sounds professional. It's corporate. It's a language he understands. You can even mention that you're focused on optimizing resource allocation for underserved demographics. See? It's the same thing, just packaged correctly. It was not the same thing. It was a sterile, meaningless string of buzzwords designed to sanitize the messy, beautiful, and profoundly human reality of my job. He was handing me a mask and telling me to wear it. I stared at him, at this man I thought knew me better than anyone, and felt a chasm opening between us. But the fear in his eyes was so palpable, so deep, that I found myself nodding. Just for one night, I told myself. It's just for one night. He visibly relaxed, taking my acquiescence as a victory. Good. Okay. Next, your family. This time, the blow was sharper, more personal. What's wrong with my family? Nothing, he said, raising his hands. But again, think of the optics. My father values legacy, lineage. When he hears your father is a mechanic, he's not going to see a hardworking man who provided for his family. He's going to see grease under the fingernails. He's going to see a lack of ambition. The image of my father flashed in my mind. His hands, calloused and stained with engine oil, were the hands that had fixed my bike when I was a child. That had held my mother's when she was sick. That had applauded louder than anyone at my college graduation. Those hands were a testament to a lifetime of honest, backbreaking work, and David was telling me to be ashamed of them. So I'm supposed to lie about my own father? My voice trembled. You don't lie, you omit. You pivot, he instructed, his voice taking on the tone of a political spin doctor. If he asks what your father does, say he runs a successful small business in the automotive sector. And your mother, she's not a school secretary. She's an administrator in the public education system. It's all about framing, Madison. It's about presenting the best possible version of the story. The best version? Or the richest sounding version? The question slipped out before I could stop it. David's face hardened. The version that won't get you dismissed before you've even had dessert. The version that will secure our future. Is that so much to ask? He made it sound so reasonable, as if he were asking me to simply choose a different brand of coffee. But he was asking me to take the vibrant, colored photograph of my life and hand it back to him in grayscale. He was asking me to be embarrassed by the very things that had made me strong, compassionate, and resilient. Every word he spoke felt like a tiny, sharp knife, methodically cutting away pieces of my identity until I was nothing but a hollowed-out shell, ready to be filled with whatever he and his family deemed acceptable. The final part of the preparation came the next day. He showed up at my apartment holding a large, flat designer garment bag. My own space, usually a sanctuary of controlled chaos and warmth, felt invaded by its sleek, imposing presence. I got you something for the dinner, he said, his smile a little too bright. He unzipped the bag to reveal the cream-colored silk dress and folded neatly beside it the cashmere scarf. It was undeniably beautiful. It was also completely alien. I didn't own anything that required dry cleaning, let alone anything that cost more than a month's salary. David, it's beautiful, but it's too much. I have a dress I can wear. No, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. You'll wear this. This designer, he's an old friend of my father's. Wearing this sends a message of respect. It shows you understand quality. It shows you belong. He held the dress up against me, and I looked at our reflection in the small mirror by my door. I saw a stranger. I saw a woman draped in a costume, her face pale and anxious. Beside her stood the man she loved, but his eyes weren't looking at her. They were looking at the dress, assessing its fit, its strategic value. He was no longer my partner. He was my handler, my director, prepping his star for the most important role of her life. And the scarf, he said, picking it up, the cashmere, was impossibly soft. You have to wear the scarf. It ties the whole outfit together. It's elegant, sophisticated. He draped it around my shoulders. It felt heavy, like a yoke. It was a uniform, a symbol of my surrender. By putting on this outfit, I would be agreeing to play the part, to be the person he needed me to be. I would be Madison Cole in name only. The final, most critical instruction was delivered over the phone the morning of the dinner. He had already called 3 times to confirm I was on schedule. Just remember the most important rule of all, Mads, he said, his voice tight with anxiety. Do not be late. I can't stress this enough. To my father, punctuality is the ultimate measure of a person. It's more important than what you say, more important than what you wear. If you're late, The evening is over before it begins. He'll see it as a profound act of disrespect. To emphasize his point, he told me a story I was sure he'd told me before, but it had a new, terrifying resonance now. When I was in college, I brought a friend home for Thanksgiving. A good guy, smart, top of his class, but he got stuck in traffic coming from the airport and walked in 10 minutes after dinner was supposed to start. My father was polite to him, but the air was Arctic. Later that night, my father told me he never wanted to see that young man again. He said, "A man who can't anticipate traffic is a man who can't anticipate market fluctuations. He's unreliable, and I have no time for unreliable people." I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't just a father with high standards. This was a king ruling over his court, and any breach of etiquette was treated as treason. "I won't be late," I promised, my own voice sounding small and distant. "I'll leave an hour early." "Good," he said, a sigh of relief on his end. "Just get through this one night, Mads. That's all I'm asking. Then everything can go back to normal." But as I hung up the phone, I knew he was wrong. There was no going back to normal. We had crossed a line. He had looked at me, at my life, my work, my family, everything that constituted the core of my being, and had deemed it all unworthy. He had asked me to hide myself, to apologize for my own existence, all for the approval of a man I had never met. And I, out of love and a desperate, misguided desire to keep the peace, had agreed. I felt hollowed out, a ghost in my own life. As I began to get ready, to slip into the silk dress and drape the cashmere scarf around my neck, I didn't feel like a woman preparing for a dinner party. I felt like a soldier putting on her armor, bracing for a battle I had already lost. I left my apartment with an hour and a half to spare. The anxiety that had been simmering for days had now reached a rolling boil, and David's chilling story about his father was on a repeating loop in my head. Unreliable people. I checked the bus schedule on my phone for the 4th time, calculated the walking distance from the bus stop to the Sterling estate, and even factored in a 10-minute buffer for unforeseen circumstances. I was determined to be perfect, punctual, poised, and polished in my borrowed Sterling-approved skin. The bus ride was agonizingly slow, each stop a fresh wave of panic. I clutched my small, elegant purse, another gift from David, so tightly my knuckles were white. The silk of the dress felt foreign against my skin, and the cashmere scarf, draped just so, felt less like an accessory and more like a leash. I felt the eyes of other passengers on me, and for the first time in my life, I felt self-conscious. My work at Second Start had exposed me to every facet of humanity, and I had long ago shed any pretense or judgment. But tonight, dressed in this costume, I felt like a fraud, and I was sure everyone else could see it too. Finally, my stop arrived. The Sterling estate was still a brisk 15-minute walk away, a journey that took me past the edge of a small city park. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, but a bitter wind was sweeping through the trees, a reminder that winter was not far off. I pulled the scarf tighter around my neck, grateful for its warmth, and quickened my pace. My sensible flats, the one concession to my own comfort I had insisted on, clicked purposefully on the pavement. I would not be late. It was then that I saw him. He was sitting on a park bench, tucked away from the main path, a lone figure silhouetted against the fading light. He was elderly, his face a roadmap of hard lines and deep-set wrinkles, a sparse, white beard clinging to his chin. He was wearing a threadbare jacket that looked painfully inadequate for the biting wind, and he was shivering, a deep, bone-rattling tremor that shook his entire frame. His hands were tucked under his arms in a futile attempt to stay warm, and his gaze was fixed on the ground, a portrait of quiet despair. My first instinct, the one ingrained in me through years of social work, was to approach, to ask if he needed help, to direct him to the nearest shelter. But a second voice, David's voice, immediately screamed in my head, "Don't get involved. You'll be late. This is not your problem tonight. Tonight is about us." I tried to listen to David's voice. I really did. I looked away, focusing on the path. Ahead, on the imposing iron gates of the Sterling estate that were now just visible in the distance. My goal was right there. Safety, approval, the future David wanted. All I had to do was keep walking, but my feet slowed. I glanced back at the man on the bench. He coughed, a dry, hacking sound that seemed to rack his thin body. He hadn't moved. He just sat there, alone and freezing as the world hurried past him. And in that moment, he wasn't a problem to be solved, or an obstacle to my perfect evening. He was just a person, a human being who was cold and suffering. I thought of the warm, hearty meal that awaited me in that mansion, the succulent roast, the fine wine, the decadent dessert. And then I thought of the sandwich in my purse. It was nothing special, just turkey and Swiss on whole wheat that I had packed for lunch and forgotten to eat. It was my only food, my backup in case the fancy dinner was one of those where the portions were artistically tiny. David's voice was frantic in my mind. "Madison, no! Don't you dare! Think about what's at stake." But then, another voice, a quieter one, my own, pushed its way through. "What is the point of getting everything you want if you have to become someone you hate to get it?" I stopped. The internal battle was brief but fierce. It was a fight for my own soul. On one side was the future David was offering me, a future of security, luxury, and acceptance. On the other was the man on the bench, a stranger who represented everything I had built my life on: compassion, empathy, and the simple, unwavering belief that we have a duty to care for one another. I turned around. Walking towards him, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. It was as if by making this small choice, by choosing to be myself, I had taken back a piece of the power I had given away over the past few days. "Excuse me, sir?" I said gently, not wanting to startle him. He looked up slowly, his eyes a pale, watery blue. They were filled with a profound weariness, but they were also surprisingly sharp, intelligent. He looked at me, taking in my expensive dress and purse, and a flicker of suspicion crossed his face. "I don't have any money," he rasped, his voice rough. "I'm not asking for any," I said with a small smile. It's really cold out here, and I noticed you were shivering. I had an extra sandwich in my bag, and I was wondering if you might like it. I didn't get a chance to eat it for lunch." I pulled the sandwich, wrapped in wax paper, from my purse. He stared at it for a long moment, then at me. His suspicions softened, replaced by a raw, unguarded hunger that was painful to see. He nodded silently, his eyes fixed on the simple offering. I placed it in his hand, and his cold, dry fingers brushed against mine. "Thank you," he whispered, the words barely audible. As he began to unwrap it, his hands shaking from the cold, I saw how inadequate his thin jacket was. The wind whipped around us, and I instinctively pulled my scarf tighter. The cashmere was so warm, so soft, a shield against the biting air. And then I looked at him, and I looked at the scarf. "No, David's," voice screamed, a final desperate plea. "Not the scarf. It's the one thing she told you to wear. It completes the look. It's the key." It was just a piece of fabric, an expensive, strategically chosen piece of fabric, a symbol of a world I didn't belong to and a person I didn't want to be. On me, it was a costume. On him, it could be a small measure of comfort, a bit of warmth in a cold, indifferent world. The choice was instantaneous. Before I could second-guess it, I was unwrapping the scarf from my neck. The cold air immediately hit my skin, but I barely noticed. "Here," I said, holding it out to him. "You need this more than I do." He looked up from his sandwich, his eyes wide with disbelief. He stared at the scarf, then back at my face, as if searching for the catch. "I can't take that," he said, his voice stronger now. That's cashmere. That's a lady's scarf." "It's just a scarf," I insisted, my smile genuine now. "And it's a cold night. Please, it would make me happy." I didn't wait for him to argue. I gently draped it over his shoulders, tucking it around his neck. It looked strangely elegant against his worn-out jacket. He touched it tentatively, his rough fingers stroking the soft fabric as if it were spun gold. He looked at me, and the weariness in his eyes was replaced by something else, something I couldn't quite name. It was a look of intense, quiet appraisal, a flicker of profound gratitude, yes, but something more, something deeper. "God bless you, young lady," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Stay warm," I said softly. I smiled one last time and turned. To hurry away, a strange lightness in my chest. I had done the right thing. I had chosen to be Madison Cole. It was only when I was half a block away that the full implication of what I had just done slammed into me. I glanced at my watch. My 10-minute buffer was gone. I was cutting it close. And then, a wave of absolute horror washed over me as I touched my bare neck. The scarf. I had given away the scarf. The one accessory David swore would make me look acceptable. The key to the entire outfit. The signal of respect to his father. I had given it to a homeless man in the park. My act of kindness. The one thing that had made me feel like myself again. was the very thing that was going to ruin everything. The lightness in my chest vanished, replaced by a cold, heavy dread. I broke into a run, my sensible flats pounding against the pavement, racing towards a judgment I now knew I was destined to fail. The iron gates of the Sterling estate were even more imposing up close. They were at least 12 feet tall, a fortress of black wrought iron and gilded spikes that seemed designed to repel not just intruders, but the entire outside world. A small, discreet camera on a post watched my breathless approach. I pressed the intercom button, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Madison Cole?" I gasped. "For Arthur Sterling." There was a moment of silence, and then a loud, metallic click as the gates began to swing silently inward. The long, winding driveway lay before me, a path leading to my doom, and standing there, at the base of the grand stone steps leading to the front door, was David. Even from a distance, I could see the rigid set of his shoulders. He was a portrait of barely contained fury. He had his phone to his ear, but he lowered it as I half walked, half ran towards him, the gravel crunching under my shoes. The mansion loomed behind him, its windows lit up with a warm, golden light that felt mocking in its welcome. As I got closer, I saw his face. His handsome features were twisted into a mask of cold anger and disbelief. His eyes, usually so warm, were like chips of ice. He didn't move to greet me, didn't offer a hand, didn't even meet me halfway. He just stood there, waiting, his arms crossed over his chest, a judge awaiting a criminal. "You're late," he said. The words were not a question or an observation. They were an indictment. He spat them out, each syllable a tiny, sharp icicle. "I know. I'm so sorry, David," I began, my words tumbling out in a rush. The bus was slow. "And then there was this man." "I don't want to hear it," he cut me off, his voice dangerously low. He took a step closer, his gaze sweeping over me, and his eyes narrowed. "Where is it? Where's the scarf?" My blood ran cold. Of all the things he noticed, it was the first. Not the panic in my eyes, not the sincerity of my apology, but the absence of a piece of fabric. I gave it away," I stammered, the words feeling utterly foolish as they left my lips. His face contorted in a way I had never seen before, a mixture of pure, unadulterated rage and something that looked terrifyingly like disgust. "You what?" he whispered, his voice seething. "You gave it away? The cashmere scarf I bought you for tonight? The one I told you was important?" "There was a man," I tried again, my voice pleading. "He was homeless, and he was freezing, David. He didn't even have a proper coat. He needed it more than I did. It was the right thing to do." He stared at me as if I had started speaking in a foreign language. The concept of what I had done was so alien to him, so completely outside the realm of his understanding, that he could only process it as a personal betrayal. "The right thing to do?" he hissed, taking another step closer, forcing me back. "The right thing to do would have been to be on time. The right thing to do would have been to listen to me for once. In your life, do you have any idea what you've done?" His voice rose with each word, the carefully controlled facade of the perfect sun cracking to reveal the terrified, furious man beneath. "I have spent months preparing for this night, setting this up, trying to present you in the best possible light to the most important man in my life. I gave you a simple set of instructions, 4 simple rules, and you couldn't even follow them. You show up late, looking flustered, and you've given away $1,000 scarf to some bum?" The word hung in the air between us, ugly and sharp. Bum! He had reduced a human being, a man I had seen as cold and hungry, to a derogatory label, a nuisance, an obstacle to his ambition. In that single, venomous word, I saw the true depth of the chasm that had opened between us. We didn't just come from different worlds. We lived in different realities, governed by entirely different moral compasses. For the first time, I saw him not as my loving partner, the man who had helped me pick up wet flyers on a rainy day, but as a terrified child, desperate and clawing for his father's approval. I saw that his fear of his father was greater than his love for me. His need for acceptance was more powerful than his respect for my values. In his world, my act of compassion was not a virtue. It was a liability, a catastrophic, unforgivable error in judgment. And in that moment, standing on the pristine gravel driveway of his family's palatial home, I felt smaller than I ever had in my life. He looked at me with such profound disappointment that I felt myself shrink under his gaze. I was a burden, a liability, a mistake he had made that he was now desperately trying to mitigate. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that crept up my neck and spread across my face. He wasn't just angry with me, he was ashamed of me, and he was making sure I knew it. "Do you realize you've probably ruined everything?" he continued, his voice dropping back to a venomous whisper. "Everything I've worked for, everything we've worked for. He's going to see you, and he's going to see someone who is careless, disrespectful, and who has no concept of value. Is that what you want? You want him to think I'm engaged to a fool?" The cruelty of his words struck me silent. A fool. That's what I was to him now. My act of kindness had been reframed as an act of stupidity. My compassion was carelessness. My character, the very essence of who I was, had been judged and found wanting, not by the reclusive billionaire inside, but by the man standing in front of me, the man who was supposed to be on my side. "David," I started, but I didn't know what to say. How could I defend myself against an accusation that was so fundamentally at odds with my own sense of right and wrong? Just fix your hair," he ordered, his tone dismissive. He turned his back on me, a clear gesture of rejection. "Try to look presentable. And for God's sake, when we get inside, don't say a word unless you're spoken to. I'll do the talking. I'll try to salvage this." He didn't wait for me. He walked up the stone steps and through the massive front doors, leaving me alone in the cold driveway to compose myself, to swallow the lump of shame and hurt that had formed in my throat. As I stood there, shivering in my beautiful silk dress, I felt a profound and devastating sense of loss. It wasn't just about the dinner anymore. It wasn't about Arthur Sterling's approval. In the space of 5 minutes, David had shown me who he truly was when the pressure was on. He had chosen his father over me. He had chosen wealth over warmth, appearances over empathy. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that no matter what happened inside that mansion, our relationship would never be the same. The bubble had not just burst, it had been obliterated. Walking behind David into the mansion was like being escorted to my own execution. The warmth of the grand foyer did nothing to chase away the chill that had settled deep in my bones. A chill that had little to do with the autumn air and everything to do with the icy words he had thrown at me. He walked a full 2 paces ahead of me, his back ramrod straight, a silent, rigid wall of disapproval. He didn't look back to see if I was following. He didn't need to. I was a liability he was now forced to manage, a problem he had to contain. A butler, who looked as ancient and as finely polished as the mahogany grandfather clock in the hall, appeared as if from nowhere. His face was a mask of placid professionalism, giving no indication that he'd heard David's furious tirade outside, though I was certain he must have. "Mr. Sterling is waiting in the dining hall, sir," the butler said, his voice a low, respectful murmur. "If you and the young lady would follow me." The young lady. He said it with such formal neutrality that it made me feel utterly anonymous, a nameless entity being brought before the king. David gave a curt nod, and the 3 of us began the long, silent procession through the heart of the mansion. The sheer scale of the place was dizzying. It was less a home and more a museum. The ceilings soared 2 stories high, adorned with intricate plasterwork. The walls were lined with enormous dark oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow my every move, their painted lips pursed in judgment. Every surface gleamed, the marble floors, the gilded frames of the portraits, the polished surfaces of antique tables that were probably older than my entire family tree. The air itself felt different here, heavy and still, thick with the scent of old money, beeswax, and a profound, unnerving silence. My sensible flats, which had felt so practical an hour ago, now seemed laughably out of place, their soft clicks echoing loudly in the cavernous space, each step an announcement of my unworthiness. My mind was a chaotic whirlwind of shame and a strange, budding resentment. I replayed David's words over and over. "Some bum. A fool. You've ruined everything." The hurt was a sharp, physical ache in my chest. This man, who had claimed to love me for my realness, had just revealed that my core values were, to him, a fatal flaw. He hadn't defended me. He had prosecuted me. And now, I was expected to walk into this room, sit before his formidable father, and pretend to be the serene, perfect fiancé he had tried to mold me into. The hypocrisy of it was staggering. I felt a flicker of anger ignite beneath the layers of humiliation. Who was he to be ashamed of me? Who was he to judge an act of simple human decency? but the anger was quickly smothered by the overwhelming dread. I was walking into the lion's den after having infuriated my guide. I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. David was no longer my partner, my shield. He was just another one of them, another person I had to please, another judge on a panel I was destined to disappoint. My chest tightened until it was hard to breathe. This was it, the final trial. The butler stopped before a pair of towering mahogany doors and pulled them open, revealing the dining hall. The sight made my breath catch in my throat. The room was immense, larger than my entire apartment. A massive fireplace, tall enough for a person to stand in, dominated one wall, a low fire crackling merrily within. But the room was not cozy. It was intimidating. The centerpiece was a long, dark, gleaming table that could have easily seated 30 people. Tonight, it was set for only three single-place settings of gleaming silver and sparkling crystal, positioned miles apart, looked lonely and absurd on the vast expanse of polished wood. The only light came from the fire and a heavy, ornate silver candelabra in the center of the table, its candles casting long, dancing shadows that made the room feel even larger and more ominous. And at the far end of the table, in a high-backed chair that looked more like a throne, sat a single figure. I couldn't see his face clearly at first. He was partially obscured by the candelabra, a silhouette against the flickering light. All I could make out was the imposing shape of a man, sitting perfectly still, his presence commanding the entire cavernous room. This was him, the myth, the legend, the recluse, Arthur Sterling. The butler glided forward and announced, "Mr. David Sterling and Miss Madison Cole." My feet felt like lead as I followed David towards the table. The walk seemed to take an eternity. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the frantic pounding of my own heart, a drumbeat of doom in my ears. David stopped at the side of the table, his posture stiff and formal. I came to a halt beside him, my hands clasped in front of me to keep them from shaking. "Father," David said, his voice strained, a poor imitation of the confident executive I knew he was. "Thank you for seeing us. This is my fiancé, Madison Cole." This was the moment. The figure at the head of the table shifted, moving out of the shadows and into the full candlelight. He turned his head slowly to look at us, and I finally lifted my gaze from the floor to meet the eyes of the man who held my future in his hands, and the world stopped. It was not a gradual realization. It was an instantaneous, brutal, system-shocking impact, like a bolt of lightning striking the ground at my feet. The air rushed from my lungs in a silent gasp. The opulent room tilted on its axis. The crackling of the fire, the ticking of the clock, the very beat of my own heart. It all faded into a roaring silence. My brain simply could not process what my eyes were seeing. It was a paradox, an impossibility, a glitch in the fabric of reality, because the man sitting at the head of the table, in the ridiculously expensive-looking silk shirt, in the throne-like chair, surrounded by more wealth than I could possibly comprehend, it was him. It was the homeless man from the park. The face was identical. The roadmap of wrinkles, the sparse white beard, the piercingly intelligent, pale blue eyes. But the weariness was gone. The desperation I had seen on the bench was replaced by an aura of absolute power and unshakable confidence. He sat straight-backed, his posture exuding a regal authority that made the grand dining hall seem like his natural habitat. My mind scrambled, trying to find a logical explanation. A brother? A long-lost twin? But then my eyes fell to his neck, and the last vestiges of denial crumbled into dust. Draped over the collar of his crisp shirt, tucked in with a casual, almost careless elegance, was my cream-colored cashmere scarf. My scarf. The one I had wrapped around his shivering shoulders, the one David had called a $1,000 scarf, the one whose absence had caused such fury, such shame, such a profound rift between us. It was there, a soft, warm beacon of absolute surreality in a scene I couldn't possibly be witnessing. He looked directly at me, his gaze bypassing his own son completely, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corners of his lips. It wasn't a kind smile. It wasn't welcoming. It was the quiet, knowing, utterly terrifying smile of a puppeteer who had just watched his puppets dance exactly as he knew they would. He knew everything. He knew I'd been late. He knew why. He'd been there. He was the reason. The test I thought I was about to take was already over. and I had no idea if I had passed or failed. I just stood there, frozen, a silent scream, trapped in my throat, staring at the impossible man who held all the cards. The silence in the dining hall stretched for an eternity. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, thick with unspoken questions and the deafening roar of my own panic. I was trapped in a state of suspended animation, my mind furiously trying to connect the dots of a picture that made no sense. The man on the bench, the man in the throne, they were the same. The knowledge was a solid, indigestible lump in my throat. David, oblivious, was the first to break the spell. He clearly hadn't recognized his own father in the disheveled state. I had. He saw only the scarf, my scarf, draped around his father's neck, and his face, which was already pale with anxiety, drained of all remaining color. He looked from the scarf to my bare neck, and then back to his father, a horrifying glimmer of comprehension beginning to dawn in his eyes. He stammered, his voice a pathetic croak, a desperate attempt to control a situation that had spiraled into a nightmare beyond his imagination. "Father, I don't understand. That scarf." But Arthur Sterling ignored him. He didn't even grant him a glance. His entire focus, his intense, piercing gaze, was fixed solely on me. It was a look that stripped away all pretense, all the carefully constructed lies David had tried to build around me. It felt as if he could see straight into my soul, weighing and measuring every decision I had made that day. I wanted to look away, to hide from the sheer force of his scrutiny, but I was pinned in place, mesmerized by the quiet, absolute power in his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the booming, authoritarian roar I had expected from the legend of Arthur Sterling. It was calm, measured, and carried a quiet resonance that filled the vast room effortlessly. It was the voice of a man who had never had to raise it to be obeyed, and it was the exact same raspy, rough voice I had heard in the park, now stripped of its feigned weakness. "This young woman," he began, his eyes still locked on mine, "was late to the most important dinner of her life." He stated it as a simple fact, without a hint of accusation, yet the words sent a fresh wave of terror through me. David flinched beside me as if he'd been struck. This was it, the indictment, the unforgivable sin. I braced myself for the dismissal, the cold rejection David had promised. Arthur paused, letting the weight of his statement settle in the silent room. "Then," he continued, his voice steady, "she was late because she stopped in the park to speak to a stranger, a man who, by all appearances, had nothing to offer her. A man who was a distraction, an obstacle to her very important schedule." He gestured almost imperceptibly with his hand. She gave this man her lunch, with no thought that it might be the only food she herself would have. She saw that he was cold, and so she gave him the scarf from her own neck, a beautiful and expensive garment, so that he might be warm. With every word he spoke, the story of my evening was being reframed. The sequence of events that David had painted as a catastrophic failure, a display of carelessness, disrespect, and foolishness, was being presented by his father as a simple, factual narrative. But the meaning, the judgment, was yet to come. I held my breath, my heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm against my ribs. Arthur Sterling leaned forward slightly, his gaze intensifying. She did not know she was being watched. She had no idea that her every move, her every choice, was being observed. He paused again, and this time, he finally turned his head to look at his son. The disappointment in his eyes was 1,000 times more potent than David's earlier anger. It was the profound, weary disappointment of a father who has had his worst fears about his child confirmed. "She did not know she was being tested," he said, his voice dropping, becoming softer but somehow more powerful. David visibly trembled, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. Then Arthur's eyes returned to me, and the hardness in them softened, replaced by something that looked unnervingly like respect. "But she passed," he said, the two words landing with the force of a gavel in a silent courtroom. "She passed the only test that truly matters." He lifted a hand and touched the soft cashmere of my scarf, his rough fingers gentle against the fabric. "Character." The word echoed in the vast, silent room. Character. The one thing I thought I was being punished for. The one thing David had tried to erase. David made a small, strangled sound, a noise of pure, unadulterated horror. The color had not returned to his face. If anything, he was paler, his skin looking waxy and translucent in the candlelight. He looked from me to his father and back. Again, his mind clearly struggling to catch up, to understand the profound and catastrophic shift in power that had just occurred. He had brought me here to be judged by his father, and in a shocking, brutal twist of fate, he was the one who had been found wanting. My own heart was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Fear, yes, but also a dizzying, soaring sense of disbelief. Vindicating. This man, this terrifying mythical billionaire, had seen me. Not the packaged, polished version David had tried to create, but the real me. The me who puts a stranger's comfort before a rigid schedule. The me who believes a person's warmth is more important than an expensive accessory. And he had not dismissed it as a weakness. He had named it as the only thing that mattered. In that moment, the fear I had been carrying for weeks began to recede, replaced by a strange, newfound calm. The judgment I had dreaded had come, but it had come for the wrong person. The trial was over, and the verdict was in. And I, Madison Cole, the social worker from the wrong side of the tracks, was the one left standing. The immense dining hall, which had been silent before, now seemed to hold its breath. The air was thick and heavy, charged with the aftershock of Arthur's pronouncement. David stood beside me, a statue carved from ice, his face a mask of utter devastation. The word his father had spoken, character, hung between us, a shimmering, razor-sharp blade that had severed the last thread of our shared reality. Arthur. Sterling leaned back in his throne-like chair, the faint, knowing smile returning to his lips. He looked at his son, truly looked at him, and the quiet respect he had shown me evaporated, replaced by an expression of profound, soul-wearying disappointment. It was the look of a master craftsman examining a piece of work he had spent a lifetime creating, only to find a fatal, irreparable flaw running through its core. "David," Arthur said, his voice deceptively soft, "tell me, what was your assessment of Miss Cole's tardiness?" He posed the question with a surgeon's precision, designed to inflict maximum damage. He was not just asking for an opinion. He was demanding that David either lie to his face or confess to the shallow, cruel values he had displayed at the gate. David's jaw worked silently, but no words came out. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, like a fish gasping for air. The silence stretched, becoming more damning with every passing second. "You have no answer?" Arthur pressed, his voice still quiet but now laced with a cold, hard edge. "Allow me to venture a guess. You were furious. You were embarrassed. You saw her actions not as a reflection of her character, but as a reflection on you. You saw a social misstep that needed to be managed, a problem that threatened your own standing. Am I close?" David couldn't meet his father's gaze. His eyes darted around the room, anywhere but at the man who was dissecting him with such brutal accuracy. He looked at me for a fleeting second, and in his eyes, I saw a desperate, silent plea. For what? I wasn't sure. For me to save him? To lie for him? But I remained silent, a spectator to a judgment he had brought entirely upon himself. "I sent you to the finest schools," Arthur continued, his voice rising almost imperceptibly, the quiet resonance gaining a steely weight. "I gave you every advantage, every tool you could possibly need to become a leader. I taught you to analyze balance sheets, to negotiate contracts, to anticipate market trends. But it seems I failed to teach you the most fundamental skill of all, how to judge the quality of a human being." He gestured with an open palm towards me. "You looked at this woman, and you saw a list of deficits, a humble background, a low-paying job, a lack of social polish. You saw things you needed to fix, to hide, to erase, so that she would be acceptable in your world. Your world, David, not mine." He let that sink in before delivering the next blow. "You judged her by her appearance. You cared only about the superficial trappings of wealth, the lateness, the luxury, the $1,000 piece of fabric you draped around her neck like a brand. You've lived in this house your entire life, surrounded by the fruits of my labor, and you have learned absolutely nothing of what it takes to build something of value. You see the gleaming surface, but you are blind to the foundation beneath, a foundation built not on cashmere and punctuality, but on grit, on integrity, and on the ability to see the worth in people when no one else can." He paused, and his gaze softened as it fell on me once more. "This woman," he said, and the respect was back in his voice, "understands foundation." In one simple, uncalculated act of kindness, she revealed a depth of character that I have spent years searching for in my own son, and have yet to find. The words were a public vivisection of David's soul. I watched as he physically seemed to shrink, sinking into himself as if trying to disappear. The anger and arrogance he had displayed at the gate were gone, replaced by the raw, exposed shame of a child who has been utterly and completely rejected by his hero. And I, to my own surprise, felt a pang of pity for him. In that moment, he was no longer the cruel arbiter of my worth. He was a product of this man, of this house, of this relentless, crushing pressure. He was a man so desperate for a crumb of approval from his father that he had sacrificed his own integrity, and mine, to get it. I was witnessing the very dynamic that had forged him into the man who had hurt me so deeply. Arthur wasn't finished. He leaned forward again, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face, making him look like a formidable hawk. "Your mother," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate tone that was somehow more devastating than a shout, "had a gift." She could see a person's heart in a single conversation. She despised arrogance and artifice. She believed that true strength was shown not in how you treat your equals, but in how you treat those who can do nothing for you. She would have adored this young woman. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine warmth in his eyes, a shadow of a long-held grief. Then he turned back to David, and his face was granite once more. "And she would have been ashamed of you tonight, David. Deeply and profoundly ashamed. To know that her son, our son, would berate a woman for an act of pure compassion. It would have broken her heart." This was the final, fatal blow. The mention of his mother, the invocation of her memory as a tool, of his condemnation, was an act of breathtaking cruelty and precision. David finally broke. A strangled sob escaped his lips, and he physically staggered back a step, sinking into the nearest dining chair as if his legs could no longer support him. He put his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking in silent, humiliated agony. His father watched him, his expression unyielding. "You came here tonight seeking my approval for your union," Arthur said, his voice ringing with finality. "You wanted me to determine if Miss Cole was worthy of the sterling name. You have it backwards. The question all along has been whether you are worthy of her." He let the silence hang for a long moment. The only sound in the room, David's muffled sobs and the crackling of the fire. "This family, this company, this name," Arthur said, his voice a low growl of absolute authority, "is built on a legacy of strength, integrity, and character. It is worthless if it is passed to a man who possesses none of those things. A man who is nothing more than a hollow suit, concerned only with appearances. A coward who is afraid of his own father." He stood up, his full height imposing, regal. He looked down the long table at his broken son. "So, here is my judgment. If this good, compassionate woman is not welcome in this family exactly as she is," he declared, his voice booming in the silent hall, "then this family is not worthy of its name, and no one should be welcome in it." He looked from his son's shaking form to me, the silent, stunned witness. His face was grim, but his eyes held a clear, unambiguous message. The test was over. The verdict was rendered, and the poetic justice of it all was as brilliant as it was brutal. I had been praised for the very qualities David had tried to erase, and he had been condemned for embodying the very values he had tried to force upon me. The world had been turned completely upside down. The aftermath of Arthur Sterling's judgment was a profound and unnerving silence. It felt as if a great storm had swept through the room, leaving a strange, ringing stillness in its wake. David remained slumped in the chair, his face buried in his hands, the picture of utter desolation. Arthur stood at the head of the table, a towering figure of patriarchal authority, his pronouncement hanging in the air like smoke, and I stood between them, no longer the terrified supplicant, but the fulcrum on which their entire world had just pivoted. In that moment, a sense of clarity washed over me, so pure and so powerful it felt like waking from a long, confusing dream. All the anxiety, all the self-doubt, all the pressure to change and contort myself into a more acceptable shape, it all just vanished. I didn't need to change who I was for anyone. I didn't need David's approval, or his mother's, or even Arthur's, though he had just given it in the most dramatic fashion possible. Arthur Sterling respected me more for the truth of my character than David ever had for the disguise he'd tried to force on me. The very foundation of our relationship, I now realized, had been built on a false premise, that I was something to be improved upon, a project to be completed. I looked at David, and the pity I'd felt earlier was now mixed with a deep, sad certainty. The man I had fallen in love with, the kind, attentive man who had helped me pick up flyers in the rain, was perhaps just another mask, one he wore when he was away from the suffocating gravity of his father. The man before me now, the one who had berated me at the gate and now wept in humiliation, was closer to the truth. A man so warped by a lifetime of seeking an impossible standard of approval that he had lost his own moral center. Slowly, deliberately, I walked over to the chair where he sat. I placed a hand gently on his shaking shoulder. He flinched at my touch. "David," I said, my voice quiet but steady. There was no anger in it, only a profound sense of finality. He looked up at me, his face streaked with tears, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with a confusing cocktail of shame, desperation, and a flicker of hope that I might somehow fix this, that I might intervene on his behalf. "Mads, I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. I know," I said. And the strange thing was, I did. I knew he was sorry. I knew his fear of his father was a powerful, distorting force. I saw, in that moment, the terrified child within the man. Arthur watched us, his expression unreadable. He had passed his judgment, and now it seemed he was waiting to see what I would do with the power he had just handed me. Would I reject his son? Would I embrace him? The old me, the me from yesterday, would have rushed to comfort David, to smooth things over, to tell Arthur it was all a misunderstanding. But the woman standing in that dining hall was different. I had been tested, and in passing, I had found a strength I didn't know I possessed. "I think I should go," I said softly, my hand leaving David's shoulder. I looked towards Arthur. "Thank you for dinner, Mr. Sterling, but I don't believe I belong here." My words surprised them both. David's head shot up, his eyes wide with panic. Arthur raised an eyebrow, a flicker of curiosity in his sharp gaze. "On the contrary, Miss Cole," Arthur said, "it seems you are the only one who truly does belong here." "With all due respect, sir," I replied, my voice gaining strength. "My world is one where kindness isn't a test, it's a reflex, where a person's worth isn't determined in a single evening, but over a lifetime of actions. Your son," I said, glancing at David's heartbroken face, "tried to make me ashamed of that world. And you used it as a weapon against him." A new, uncomfortable silence fell. I had not just accepted his verdict. I had questioned the very nature of his trial. "I don't want to be a part of this game," I finished, my voice clear and unwavering. "Not as a pawn, and not as a prize." I turned and walked away from the table, away from the father and the son and their toxic, gilded world. My steps were sure and steady. I had walked into this mansion a terrified girl playing a part. I was walking out a woman who knew her own value. I was halfway to the door when David's voice, choked with desperation, called out, "Madison, wait!" I stopped but didn't turn around. I heard him get up, his chair scraping against the floor. He rushed to my side, grabbing my arm gently. "Please," he begged, his voice raw. "Don't go. He's right. Everything he said, it's true. I was a coward. I was so terrified of him, of what he would think of you, of me, that I became someone I don't even recognize. What I said to you at the gate, it was unforgivable, but it wasn't me, not the real me." I finally turned to look at him. The tears were streaming down his face, but for the first time that night, I saw something genuine in his eyes. The masks were gone, all of them. What was left was a man who was utterly broken, but also, perhaps for the first time, utterly honest. "Love you, Madison," he said, his voice a whisper. "I love you for your compassion, for your strength, for everything I tried to make you hide tonight. I was wrong, and I am so, so sorry." His shame was real. It was a palpable, gut-wrenching thing. This wasn't a performance to win back his father's favor. This was a man confronting the ugliest part of himself and hating what he saw. And in that moment of raw, painful honesty, I found the capacity for forgiveness. It wasn't about excusing his actions. His words at the gate had wounded me deeply, and that scar would not easily fade. But I understood the source of the poison. I saw that his cruelty to me was born from a cruelty that had been inflicted upon him his entire life. I forgave him, not for the man he had been an hour ago, but for the broken, honest man who stood before me now. "We can't go back to the way things were, David," I said softly, my voice full of a sadness for what we had lost. "I don't want to," he insisted, his grip on my arm desperate. "I want to start over. I want to build something real, with you, but not here. Not on his terms, on our terms, on your terms." I looked past him, back at Arthur Sterling, who had remained standing at the head of the table, watching this exchange with an unreadable expression. Our eyes met. I gave him a small, respectful nod, a gesture of thanks for seeing me, but also a declaration that I was not his to control. He, in turn, gave a slight inclination of his head, a gesture of concession, of release. That night shifted everything. It was not a fairy tale ending where the prince and I rode off into the sunset. It was the beginning of something much harder and much more real. We started over. We went to therapy. David began the long, arduous process of untangling his identity from his father's expectations. He started volunteering at Second Start, quietly, without fanfare, not to impress me, but to understand my world, to understand the value of a life not measured in dollars. He began to find his own foundation. Our new beginning wasn't built on the hollow promises of wealth or status. It was built on the rubble of that disastrous night, on a foundation of brutal honesty, painful self-awareness, and a hard-won forgiveness. It was built not on his father's terms, not on his old terms, but on mine. That dinner taught me something powerful, something that has become a guiding principle in my life. You never, ever fail when you choose kindness. What might look like a weakness or a foolish distraction to a world obsessed with status and efficiency may be the very thing that reveals your true strength. It may be the very thing that saves you. My worth wasn't determined by a billionaire's test or a fiancé's approval. It was forged in my own choices, in the small, quiet moments. It was affirmed not when I was given the expensive scarf, but when I chose to give it away. Before you go, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more stories, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'd love to hear your thoughts.